А, или это оно и было? Ну, давайте, да, да, ну, чтобы, да, ну, понятно, да. В обществе надо не взять из общества, вот я тебе про это говорю, из общества уходишь слабак, значит, понимаешь? Надо в мегаполис, да, понял тебя. Да, да, да. Это первое, что в голову приходит. Ну тогда надо уйти все, то есть как бы да. Типа деревню куда, деревню подальше, да, понимаю это. Я понял. Да, на туда где? Чтобы, ну да, токсичная среда, как бы, чтобы там тренировать, чтобы там мужиком быть. Блин. Чтобы навыки свои оттачивать там, где ты реально никто, понимаешь? Ну сиди в сюмсях, вот ты, вот и все, там самый лучший будешь на деревне, да. Просто, мне так и говоришь, надо, да, понимаю, там, да, это не, я тебе больше скажу, то есть, да, то есть, это как свинья, то есть свою жизнь проживешь как животное, понимаешь? Да, то есть в темноте, в заслуженном забвении, понятно, нет? То есть как бы антирод человеческий, да, понимаете? Да, да. Ну наоборот, значит, да, да, ну нет, ну, у женщин, женщина, а тебе зачем перемещаться-то? Женщина, я думаю, я не буду за вас решать, это ваши проблемы. Только это у меня такое отношение просто, да. То есть, ну так это же хорошо, она как бы, да, ее покорить надо, она такая, ага, типа там недвижимая какая-нибудь, там, да, подземелье где-нибудь, не знаю я. Да, просто так уже, да, то есть. Поэтому я про женщин здесь вообще не говорю, чтобы женщина куда-то ехала, что-то, да, чисто мужской разговор, типа того, да. Что-то она решала, делала, это умиляет просто, да, понимаю, в этом случае, да. Ну ладно, ладно, все нормально. Да, поймешь, короче. Я в том смысле, что, да, да, то есть ехать, роман писать куда-то в забвение, я в это не верю. Да, то есть надо сидеть в мегаполисе, в центре города, большие налоги платить за квадратный метр, на котором ты сидишь с печатной машинкой. Вот, и печатать, чтобы люди читали это и продавали, и чтобы по всему миру твои произведения, это то, что и ответишь своим духом, на что смог выработать, например. Да. Да. Только это все полза вчерашнее. Сейчас уже понимаешь, что это тоже учитывай. Понимаете, да. То есть, как бы, да, ничего, это и хорошо, и плохо, да. Ой, это плохо, да, ой, вообще. Да, да, понимаю, да. Ну да, то, что сегодня, да, понял меня же тоже. То есть жить можно еще как, понимаешь? Да, то есть, постоянно тебя понял уже. Ну все от тебя, да, сомкнись на себе, да, как ты вот есть один только, ты один есть. Что ты для людей делаешь, что ты, поймет он тебя просто, да. Женщины делать для людей могут только что-то не очень хорошее. Потому что, ну делать для людей, я имею в виду, для общества за деньги, я имею в виду. Дома вот нормально, наверное. То, что наоборот, она тебя поняла. Да, да, да. Нет, я ничего, я не навязываю вам. Ну, скажем так, они просто так находятся в этом мире, просто они пока ничего, да. Не беременные пока все, несчастные, не на своих местах. Но у меня не женский организм, я поэтому тебе не могу сказать, я тебе по-мужски вот только говорю, все. Я, да, понимаю, да, понимаю, да, да. Это их проблема, ну ладно, мне не касается. Да, да, да. Да, да, да. Ну, наверное, нет. Ну нет, а что я тебе пожелаю? Вот пожелаю я тебе добра, счастья, любви и беременности. Чтобы постоянных от одного мужика. И отсутствие мужских начинаний в тебе, да, понимаешь. Видишь, для них это все как проклятие, да. Понимаете, уже. То есть, понял тебя просто, слушай. Меня не касается, все пока. Привет. Да. Кушать, конечно.
They had to clean things up a bit, and I didn't really want to have to work with a solution of uranium. Thankfully, however, cleaning it up wasn't exactly going to be super difficult, and I just had to do a quick filtration. I did this by passing it through some cotton and some sea light, which is kind of like
Ну, тебя как на
superfine
сетку
sand.
брали.
The stuff that initially passes through tends to still be a bit cloudy, so I let it run for a bit, and then I swapped it out for a new beaker and put the other stuff through it again. After this, it was perfectly nice and clear, but there was still a bunch of uranium solution all over the funnel and in the contact sea light, so I washed it out with a bit of water. When all the water had eventually passed through, I took away the funnel, and the solution was pretty much good to go. Now, to convert this to the sodium diurenate, I had to react it with something called sodium hydroxide. This is also known as lye, and it's often sold as drain cleaner, and that's where I get all mine from. For this reaction, it also all had to be dissolved in water, but the exact concentration of it didn't really matter. I figured that something around 30% by weight would probably be good, so I measured out about 70 mils of water and dumped in roughly 30 grams. It all dissolves relatively easily into water, but it also generates a lot of heat, so in the end, the solution is usually pretty hot. However, I wanted it to be closer to room temperature, or maybe just slightly warm, so I put it in the fridge to cool it down. When I felt that it was good, I took it out of the fridge, and I started slowly adding it to the uranyl nitrate. Almost immediately, it started forming these weird, solid, kind of donut-looking things, and this was all sodium diurenate. The reason this happened was because unlike the uranyl nitrate and the sodium hydroxide, the sodium diurenate is practically insoluble in water, so the moment that it formed, it separated out. What I had to do now was basically just keep adding the sodium hydroxide until it stopped making the diurenate. At this point, it was still pretty simple because the solution was nice and clear and it was really obvious to see.
All you do in your DAW, whatever DAW it is literally just drag and drop.
We can drag one of these chord progressions in. Boom, just like that. It's a vibe.
The Unison MIDI chord pack.
The Unison chord pack, the Unison MIDI chord pack is absolutely bananas. It is insane.
I was just messing with this earlier, and this has helped a ton with just starting off those main melodies, because at first...
However, I eventually started stirring it, and the whole thing got a bit murky, so I couldn't just rely on looking at it. Instead, to know when it was done, I had to keep testing the pH. I did this just using some cheap pH papers, and I kept that in the hydroxide until it turned blue, which told me that the pH was about 10. After this, I just let it sit there for a bit to make sure that it all fully reacted, and then I filtered it off. I just did this by pouring it through a simple coffee filter, and when most of the water had passed through, I washed it a few times with distilled water. I then let it sit there until all that water passed through as well, and
Столько времени
now
провел, ну
I
ладно.
had some relatively clean sodium diurenate.
Тоже, да.
It was all still wet and goopy though, and I'd have to dry it out, but it was going to take forever just sitting here in the strainer. With other chemicals, I'd usually just set up a fan on the side to help speed things up, but that would probably end up shooting a small amount of dust into the air, and I didn't really feel comfortable doing that with uranium. So instead, I carefully took out the coffee filter and I put it in a bowl and I pulled a vacuum on it. Under a vacuum, water vaporizes a lot more, and this makes it dry a lot faster. In a closed space though, like in this vacuum chamber, there's nowhere for the water vapor to go. So to fix this problem, I included a bunch of drying salt at the bottom, which would constantly pick up the water vapor. I pulled it out about 5 hours later, and it was mostly dry. I purposely didn't let it dry completely, because I wanted to avoid as much dust as I could. By keeping it slightly wet and a bit pasty, I was able to pretty safely scrape it all off, without making any death clouds. Also, besides the safety issue, I was worried that if I let it dry completely, that it would just stick to the paper and become impossible to separate. I was able to get almost all of it and put it into a small bottle, but there was still some stuff to the paper. Getting this last bit was a lot sloppier than I wanted it to be, but I didn't really have any other alternative. I just did my best to scrape it all off, and then everything that even remotely came into contact with the uranium was put into a special waste container. Everything that I took off was transferred to the same small bottle, and I did it as carefully as I could, but it was still a bit messy. There was a bit of uranium that managed to get on the outside of the bottle, and I of course had to clean that up. And I did this by just wiping it down a few times with some wet paper towel. Now, with all the uranium safely
Да наоборот. Ну, наоборот, да, чё ты, да? Как это есть? Да, наоборот, да. Да, наоборот, да, я понял. Да. Я один шпиль умею играть, говорит, да. Только тоже. Чего меня врубает-то все время наоборот? Слова ему не нравится, наоборот. Наоборот. Да, наоборот. Вот наоборот, ладно. Четвертого уже, блин. Четвертого уже. Ну да. Ну да. Будешь знать, как встал, и все, да. Это-то. Что, бояться меня, что ли? Hey, thanks, Rahmat. Шедуарный аппарат.
in the bottle, and none of it on the outside to poison me when I touched it. I was ready to finish drying it. To do this, I put it into the same vacuum chamber that I used earlier, and I pulled a really strong vacuum on it. I wanted it to be as absolutely dry as possible, so I left it in there for 3 or 4 days. So I came back to it a few days later, repressurized the chamber and took it out, and well, it worked. It was really dry. When it's dry like this, though, it has a tendency to give off dust and powder, which is obviously really horrible to breathe in. This was why I only dried it completely in the final container that I was storing it in, so I wouldn't have to move it around or handle it. I went ahead and weighed what I had here, and it came out to be 9 grams, which was about what I expected. Just for fun, I decided to test it with the Geiger counter, and you can see that the glass was able to block most of the radiation. The reading that it had was only barely above the normal background level, but that totally changed when I moved it over the top. The reason this happened was that most of the radiation that was being let off here was in the form of alpha and beta particles, and they just couldn't make it through the glass. As I mentioned before though, this counter isn't able to pick up alpha particles in general, so what I was seeing here was probably mostly from beta particles. Now one other thing that I wanted to try was to shoot UV on it.
Ну что, ты опять потерял все деньги на Форексе. Ну или вложился в очередную какую-нибудь финансовую пирамиду. Тебе не надоело постоянно быть без денег и безуспешно пытаться где-то там чего-то заработать? Меня зовут Иван Коваль-Зайцев, и я 16 лет зарабатываю деньги на бирже. Я знаю хитрые ходы мошенников, я знаю, как отличить настоящего брокера от мусора, который пытается кинуть тебя на бабки. И я расскажу об этом все на своем бесплатном онлайн-семинаре. Расскажу стратегию, которая позволит тебе зарабатывать деньги из любой точки мира. Расскажу, как не попасться на удочку всяких разводил, как тебе развиваться в этой теме, чтобы зарабатывать все больше и больше денег. Жми на кнопку на этом видео и регистрируйся на мой бесплатный вебинар. Я обучил больше 2000 человек. Мои выпускники зарабатывают в среднем от 100 тысяч рублей в месяц. И не зависит ни от кого. И ты тоже так сможешь. Жми на кнопку и регистрируйся на онлайн-семинар прямо сейчас. Увидимся.
Ну наоборот.
And I was
Тоже так
surprised
думаешь,
they
да?
didn't
Смотри, какой-то
collapse.
градиент. Либо ты зажированный, да, он тебя понял, да, либо ты мужик, да. То есть как бы не факт, что надо так, да, понять. Налегке, понимаешь? Потому что если еда даже такая, например, да, то есть, к примеру, ты такой, надо такую вот еду большую есть, а если все лишь фрукты, например, если, да, понимаешь? Ну, я понял, ну, к примеру, если я так говорю. Ты мужик, тебе решать, понимаешь? Женщина, да, понимаешь, да. Ну, не думай, значит, ладно. Улучшай свою жизнь, значит. Ну, слушай, да. Ну, наоборот, ну да. Ну да. Ну страдай тогда. Живи свою, еще, это еще хуже. Живи свою жизнь напрасно. Вот тебе, да, продюсер, да, понимаешь. В быт. Расширение быта и думание за чужие головы, как будто бы. Ну да. Ну хорошо, хорошо. Нет, если это плохо, то по-любому там твое плохо будет. Вот за что ты стыд, да, понял это. Твое в том числе, да, понял он тебя просто. Да. Нашел у себя уже. Ладно, ну ладно, свое говорит.
I mean, maybe it was fluorescing and it was just super weak, but as far as I could tell.
Ничего, набороться, как бороться будешь, наработать надо просто, все. Так, согласен хоть нет? Я не понимаю там тебя, что да.
Если вы когда-нибудь пробовали волевым усилием преодолеть свою лень, то знаете, нас.
This video has been sponsored by Raycon. Also, please don't try recreating anything that you see here. Cyanide is probably one of the most well-known poisons, and in many movies and shows, I've heard them say that it smells like almonds. I've also heard chemists say it, and I've seen it written in a lot of articles and warnings. However, I've never actually smelled it myself, which is probably a good thing, but I've always wondered how true it was. It just seemed weird to me that something so toxic could smell good. This is because when toxic things have a smell, they're usually bad, which lets you know to get away from it. If cyanide smells like nice almonds though, I feel like I'd be more likely to go towards it. This just didn't really seem right to me, so I decided that I had to see for myself. To make this happen, what I had to do was pretty simple, and I just had to smell some cyanide. However, I didn't just have a bunch of cyanide sitting around, and I had to order some. I was originally planning to just get a few grams of it, but for small quantities, it was really overpriced. I'm really not sure how I rationalized it, but I somehow convinced myself that it was much smarter to get a full kilo instead. However, I have no idea how I'm even going to use a fraction of this, and if you guys have any interesting suggestions, I'd love to hear them. Okay, so I now had a bunch of cyanide, and it was all in the form of sodium cyanide. This is one of the most common forms of it, and what I've always found interesting is how boring it looks. When I first saw sodium cyanide a few years ago, I really thought its appearance would match its scary reputation, but it was about as fear-inducing as table salt. It also wasn't as poisonous as I thought. I always assumed that it was insanely dangerous, and that just a speck of it could kill you. However, for the average adult, you need a few hundred milligrams, which is actually quite a bit. I mean, it's also not a lot, but there's no way that you would just accidentally eat this much. Either way, I now had the cyanide, and ideally, I would have just smelled it to get my answer, but it unfortunately wasn't that easy. This is because sodium cyanide is a solid, and like a lot of other solids, it doesn't smell like anything. It's just not letting off enough vapor to detect it, and it's the same reason why you can't smell table salt. When people talk about smelling cyanide, they're usually referring specifically to hydrogen cyanide, which is a gas. This can be detected in extremely low concentrations, and it's one of the most dangerous forms. This is because you really don't need that much of it in the air for a few good breaths of it to be fatal. But anyway, with that being said, the next thing that I had to do was make some hydrogen cyanide. To do this, I started by measuring out just 3 milligrams of the sodium cyanide, which was basically a single crystal. I then added about 25 mils of water, and I stirred it until it completely dissolved. What I had now was a solution of sodium cyanide, but it was insanely dilute. It would probably take 100 times more cyanide to kill me, and even if I took this whole thing as a shot, I'd still be fine. I then put the beaker into a small chamber, along with a cyanide meter that I had rented. Initially, it didn't look like much was happening, but after a few minutes, the meter started detecting cyanide. This was happening because when sodium cyanide is exposed to water or moisture, it slowly hydrolyzes and turns into hydrogen cyanide. As a gas, this then escaped the beaker, and it started filling the chamber. The goal now was to get it concentrated enough that I could for sure smell it, but not enough that it would be dangerous. To find out what this would be, I did a little research online, and I was able to find this table. It was honestly a bit scary to see the words immediate death, but it was also only at very high concentrations. When it got down to between 20 and 40 parts per million, or ppm for short, it said that it only caused slight symptoms after a few hours. For me to smell it though, it would probably take at most a few seconds, so I figured this would be totally fine. I also found this on the CDC website that said up to around 50 ppm can be tolerated for 30 to 60 minutes. Based on this, and a lot of other info that I was able to find, it seemed totally fine to go with something like 40 ppm, but I wanted to be as safe as possible. So, I decided to start at around 15 ppm, and I figured if I couldn't smell it, I could always just increase it. After a few minutes, it was only around 3.5 ppm, and it was going to take a while to get to 15. So, I decided to give it a little boost by shooting in some extremely dilute sulfuric acid. This would immediately react with the sodium cyanide and convert it to the hydrogen cyanide. I then closed the chamber, and very quickly, the concentration started increasing. In this case, adding this acid was okay, because I was working with barely any cyanide. However, it can be extremely dangerous. If it were added to a concentrated solution, or pure cyanide, it would start pouring off a crazy amount of hydrogen cyanide. This can be very hard to control, and depending on the scale, it can quickly fill a room with a fatal concentration. In general, you usually do everything you can to avoid mixing the two, and there are very few circumstances that you ever need to. When it got just slightly above 14 ppm, I was ready to test it.
Вот этот товар мы покупаем в Китае за 150 рублей, а продаем на Валбере за 1500.
Okay, so I have my scary little box here, and I guess I just have to smell it. Honestly, it's not as strong as I thought it would be, but it's also, it's not at all like an almond. I would not associate this at all with food. It really has a chemical smell. It kind of smells like bleach or chlorine. And maybe a little bit like an indoor pool that has too much chlorine in the air. Either way, it's not almonds. I don't smell anything that resembles almonds here. Maybe I just don't remember what almonds smell like. Maybe I've just never smelled an almond before. I think that's possible. So I think I have to go and see what an almond actually smells like. Okay, so what I had to do next was smell some almonds, and I picked up a pack of some gourmet ones from the dollar store. Now, all I had to do was cut it open and test it out. It kind of just smells like nothing. Yeah, nothing. Smells like nothing. I was honestly a bit surprised by this, but I figured that it was just because they all still had their skin on them. So I started thinking that maybe if they were crushed up, it might make a difference. When they all looked more or less destroyed, I tested them again. Okay.